Recently, I was asked to do a video lecture on the topic of mourning. And of course, here we have to start with Freud's classic 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholia. By melancholia, of course, he meant what today we call depression. So, for Freud, we start with a loss of some kind, and of course the loss need not be the death of a significant other. It could be, yes, the loss of a person, the breakup of a relationship, but it could also be the loss of a career, the loss of a long-cherished hope, the loss of a child, the loss of a job, any kind of really significant loss needs to be mourned. And Freud begins by noticing the similarities between mourners and people suffering from melancholia or depression. The mourner traditionally wore black. The depressed person's world goes black. So he's interested in differentiating between what he thinks of as normal mourning and depression, which he comes to see as a kind of failed mourning or a process of pathological mourning. Okay, in normal, healthy mourning, Freud uses the term the work of mourning, and he describes it really as the work of reality testing. The object has been lost, the object is no longer there, and it takes a considerable time for the mind to gradually come to accept its absence, its loss, its non-existence. We are reluctant to part with valued objects, and when it's a very important object, like a person, a close person, it may take a year or two to move through the process of mourning, this process of testing reality over and over and over again. Once again, I discover that the object is not there. The object is lost. The object is dead. I'm reluctant to face the facts, and it takes time for me to come to terms with the painful fact that the object is gone. This reminds me that in his work on attachment and loss, John Bowlby describes the well-known fact that mourners, people who have recently had a significant loss, can often be found wandering or prowling around the house as if they're looking for something, but they're not aware really of what it is they're looking for, or even of the fact that they are looking for something. And of course, they're looking for the lost person unconsciously. Mourners often have quasi-hallucinatory experiences. I recall one myself, some months after my mother died. I was driving home from the college where I taught, and suddenly there she was walking along the street. I hit the brakes and pulled over, and then quickly realized that this woman was not my mother. There was a certain resemblance, but I was virtually hallucinating my mother's presence. So this kind of thing can happen. One's reality testing takes time to process the difficult and painful fact that the object is gone. A relationship has broken up. And on one level, consciously, you feel you face this, but then on the radio you hear a song that meant something to you and your lost partner, and the song stirs up the pain, and once again one is having to recognize that the relationship is over, the object is lost. Mourning intensifies. It's another bit of saying goodbye. Okay, these kinds of experiences can keep recurring for over a year, but gradually, in the case of healthy mourning, the work of mourning is increasingly done, and the ego, which is the center of reality testing in the psyche and of the reality principle, has done its work, and the reality of the absence or the loss is faced, and gradually the mourning process, the work of mourning is done. It's as if the black and white film begins to turn into technicolor. Winter departs, spring arrives, the flowers poke up, and life goes on. This idea of the work of mourning as able to be completed has been criticized, among others, by Jacques Derrida, people who suggest that to be human there is a fundamental loss, a fundamental abjection, a fundamental separation. I suppose biblically one can see this as depicted in Genesis, where we're thrown out and a flaming sword is set up at the east, preventing our re-entry. This is a fundamental loss, the loss of paradise. Paradise lost. The critics of Freud argue that this loss can never be fully mourned, except in pathology. Pathology, in this alternative view, is the closing off of the perpetual or existential mourning that must carry on. I think Derrida uses the metaphor of a wound that must go on bleeding. In this perspective, to be fully human is to suffer an open wound and to carry on with the bleeding, metaphorically, so that the idea of the end of mourning and the work being done, Freud's idea, is rejected by these more existential postmodern theorists. This touches Lacanian theory, where, of course, for Lacan, the goal of psychoanalysis is acceptance of castration, a fundamental loss, a fundamental wound, and health is coming to terms with this, not overcoming it or moving past it through a mourning process that has a beginning and an end. In any case, for Freud, the loss in health is mourned, the mourning process completes, and one returns to normal life. Okay, this contrasts with melancholia. In melancholia, the mourning process breaks down. It cannot be completed, and Freud's idea is that the reason the person is stuck and can't move through the mourning process is because the object that was lost was more hated than loved. For Freud, all human relations that reach any depth are ambivalent, a mixture of love and hate. But when one's hatred for the object overpowers one's love, it's as if one can't let go because of something like a hate bond. One needs to go on hating the object, and so one can't let go of it. But what happens is that one, in melancholia, one identifies with the hated lost object, and one introjects the hated lost object, and identifies with it and goes on attacking it. But on the surface, this looks like self-attack. The self has become identified with the hated lost object, and in ongoingly hating myself, I'm really hating the object that I've become identified with. Okay, so this is depression or melancholia. People often say, well, I had a good relationship with my mother, so it's going to be terribly hard to let go and mourn that loss. But my father, I never got on with him very well, and so it will be easy to survive his loss. Freudian theory suggests quite the opposite. It's much easier to let go of the less ambivalently loved objects. The more the object is loved, the more one can replace it in the real world with positive memories. Loving the object enables us to let go. It's the hated objects that are really hard to let go, and it's these that lead to the condition of melancholia. We won't let go. We hate the object too much to let go, so we internalize it, and we end up identifying with it, and we end up engaging in a process that looks like self-hate, self-attack, self-punishment, self-denigration, but really the self is identified with the hated object, and one is going on hating it internally. Okay, the distinction between mourning and melancholia. Of course, in 1917, in talking about this process of introjecting the ambivalently loved object, the hated object, and in identifying with it, Freud is making a major contribution to what later will be called object relations theory. He's talking about an internal world now, and he's talking about taking external objects and introjecting them, internalizing them into the inner world, and then sometimes identifying with these objects that have been taken into the internal world. And this process of what looks like self-hatred, but which is really an ongoing attack on an internal object with which I've become identified, this 5 years later, in 1923, in The Ego and the Id, forms a central element of the theory of the superego. This becomes clearer as time goes on in Freud's writings, but essentially the superego is an internal attacker. The process that he describes in pathological mourning or melancholia of self-attack, that later will be conceived of as the activity of the superego. So depressed people have severely hostile superegos loaded with hate and deploying their hatred against the self. And of course, very often the self is being hated is a self that is identified with hated lost objects. Okay. Well, what are the implications of this for therapy or for cure of depression? Well, broadly speaking, depression is seen as a problem of hate. The depressed person is a hater, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we don't enjoy being around seriously depressed people. They are full of hate. Most of their hate is being dumped on themselves, but one has the feeling when one is around a seriously depressed person that one is kind of walking on eggs, as if you sense that if you make one false move, suddenly all of that hate that's being turned on himself or herself is suddenly going to be deployed against you. You can easily become the target. Mostly they have their self as their target, but that could switch pretty easily, and you could be the target of an attack. Seriously depressed people seem at times to be attacking everything, mostly themselves, but often almost everything. So it's a hate problem, which is not to deny that they are sufferers. They are both the agents and the victims of the hate. Now, of course, consciously, they feel themselves entirely to be victims of a, quotes, illness that seems to come out of the blue. They're not at all conscious of its deeper roots. All they know is that they suffer. They don't often have much of a sense that they are the agents causing the suffering. They don't have much awareness that they are haters. Okay, so then what is the cure? Well, the cure has to be a conversion from hatred to love. The trouble with depressed people is they can't love themselves. They're too busy hating. In the long run, they have to learn how to let go of the hatred, and they have to learn how to love. They have to learn how to love others and love themselves. All of which is to say that, of course, depression is a narcissistic condition. Nowadays, people seem to associate narcissism with grandiosity and arrogance. That's only one form of narcissism. In depression, we're looking at negative narcissism. We're looking at a person who, just as much as the grandiose person thinks that everything is about themselves, they can't get their minds off themselves. Donald Trump can't get his mind off himself. He's so great, he thinks. A hero in his own mind. But the depressed person is equally narcissistic. He can't get his mind off himself about how inferior he is, or how sinful he is, or how bad or stupid or inferior he is. But he's equally self-obsessed, and therefore rather a pain to be around. Again, I don't mean to sound as if I'm not empathic with his or her suffering. These are people in pain, and they need help. But they're very narcissistic. And of course, the cure involves finding a way to gradually transcend this narcissism, which is a process of kind of like gradually waking up and realizing, wait a minute, there's a world out there. There's a world outside me. And there are people who aren't me. And it's not all about me. There's this object world that I can wake up and hopefully begin to care about, and hopefully to begin to be able to love. And as I am able to move out of the narcissistic shell into recognizing the reality of other people and begin to care about them, then I begin to be able to also love myself in a genuine way. Of course, the big confusion about narcissism is people think that narcissists have an excess of self-love, when in reality they have a total deficit of self-love. They have self-obsession. They have self-preoccupation precisely because they don't love themselves and can't love themselves. And if they did love themselves genuinely, they would become interested in the world, and they would become interested in other people instead of self-obsessed. So the two forms of narcissism, grandiose and depressed, but equally narcissistic. Okay, so what's the cure? It's helping people learn to love. And here psychoanalysis, of course, is centrally in the same position as the major Abrahamic religions, which also see the key to emotional maturity and health as the growing and increasing capacity to love, and as the transcendence of narcissism. Freud knew that in 1914. We must begin to love, or we will fall ill, and we must fall ill if we are unable to love, he says in 1914. One wishes he had stayed more centrally focused on that insight, but instead he switched to this kind of ego, superego, human versus id, beast, animal drive defense psychology. He became preoccupied with that, and the whole field became preoccupied with that. But early on he had seen that the key problem is narcissism, both grandiose and depressed narcissism, and he saw that the cure was love. He never wanted to admit that very openly because he hated religion so much. In any case, okay, mourning for Freud, the work of mourning. He imagines that these losses in health can be gradually recognized. The object is gone. I can come to terms with this, and I can resume my interest in life when the work of mourning has been done, except in the case of Melancholia, where I hated the object too much to be able to let it go, to be able to mourn it and let it go. Okay, Melanie Klein makes an important contribution to the theory of mourning. For Klein, Freud's view is okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough because it's focused on the subject of reality testing, and it's focused on helping a person come to grips with the reality that the object is lost. So it's enhanced reality testing, and it's focused on recognizing that in the external world the object is gone. Hard to face, but over time, hopefully, we face this loss and we recognize the reality the object is lost. That's Freud. Klein says in cases of significant degrees of mourning, something much more complex is going on another level altogether, because the loss of the good object in the real external world has shaken my confidence that the good object continues to exist in my internal world. The loss of the real person in the real world has confronted me with the feeling that my internal good object may be lost or is also lost. And the internal good object is the basis of my faith in the goodness and viability of life. I mean, it is my internal protector. It's my internal loving and beloved caretaker. It's based on the internalization of the good breast, the good primary carer. Major task of infancy is the building up of this good internal object through internalizing the goodness of the real carers. Now, the carers will also be frustrating, inevitably, and so there will be the good aspect of the carer, but then there will be the bad, frustrating aspect, the good part object breast and the bad part object breast. But hopefully the carer is good enough, to use Winnicott's phrase, that that the love will be, my experience will entail a preponderance of love over hate, a preponderance of gratification over frustration, and the result of this is a growing confidence that there is a good object that will respond to my needs. There is the building up of confidence in the reality of this internal good object that I've taken inside me. And this leads to a sense that ultimately, despite all of the frustrations entailed, the world is fundamentally a good place, that life is worth living, that love exists, that people will respond to me and help me, and this enables me to identify with the good object and to become good towards others. As I've been loved and feel love, I have love inside me, and I can deploy this love now towards others. So this process of the building up of the good internal object is crucial, and it is threatened by the loss of a good object in the real external world. I'm shaken. And so mourning is not just a matter of facing the objective loss in reality, it's also a rebuilding of the internal good object, a rebuilding of my confidence in the internal good object. And so that's what mourning is really about. It's not just about reality testing, it's about a creative construction or reconstruction of something that has been damaged. It involves repair of the damaged good internal object. And ideally, I see myself engaging in these acts of reparation. I may become creative. Klein noticed that as a person begins to overcome a depression, they can sometimes begin to engage in a kind of creativity. And creativity involves bringing something good into the world. You take a blank piece of paper and you create a drawing or a painting. You have brought something good into being, which demonstrates that you have goodness inside you and are able to bring it out and to bring something good into the world. One thinks of a mother birthing a child, and one of the terrible difficulties when the child arrives in a damaged state, the mother feels, you see, I don't have goodness inside me. I could not produce a healthy baby. I produced a damaged baby. The fantasy is that I am destructive, not merely constructive. The joy of producing a healthy baby is that it confirms my sense that I'm good, that I have goodness inside me, and I can bring good things into the world, be it a baby, be it a poem, be it a painting, constructive work of some kind. So my confidence in my goodness has been shaken by the loss of the good object, and I have to gradually rebuild this through reparative activities of various kinds that lead to the reconstruction of the internal world, not just facing objectively the reality of the object's absence in the external world. So Klein adds this important dimension to our understanding of what mourning involves. So there's probably, I would say, a difference in technique between strictly Freudian and more Kleinian analysts. The Kleinian is alert to signs of creativity. He's alert, or she is alert to the patient's need to rebuild their internal world, and is alert to symbolic steps. At the root, it might be simply organizing one's home, cleaning and vacuuming and repairing things that need to be repaired. All of this being an external manifestation of what is going on internally, the attempt to repair and reorganize the disturbed internal world, the world that has been disturbed by the loss in the real world. So Kleinians tend to be alert to these signs of creativity, these signs of reparation, and are inclined to encourage them because they're seen as parts of a healthy reconstruction process or reparation process. If I could take a personal illustration, I spent 46 years teaching at the university, and 6 or 7 years ago I formally retired, and I was very attached to university teaching, to lecturing, to classrooms of students. And when you've been doing that at the college I taught at, we had 9 contact hours with in-class hours every week, 3 courses. That's a lot of teaching over 46 years. It's a bit of a shock to the system to have to give that up suddenly. Fortunately, in my case, I belong to this other world, the world of psychoanalysis, and at the Institute I could carry on teaching courses in Freud, Klein, Winnicott, etc. And so I did not have to give up teaching altogether, but I certainly had to give up a big chunk of the teaching that I had been doing over the years. And suddenly I begin to do these YouTube video lectures. You could say it's an addiction. I'm addicted to teaching. I'm not putting it down. I think it's, as addictions go, it's a fairly creative and useful one. And I get very nice feedback about it from people who watch these videos and tell me that they find them useful. So I'm validated as a teacher. I've discovered I don't need the university. There's the University of YouTube, and I can go on teaching till I drop. But of course, this is also part of a mourning process. I would say a healthy process of mourning the loss of my career as an academic. I find a way to carry on in a different way. Another illustration, personally, is the loss of my vision. I've suffered from macular degeneration of the retina for many years and had many treatments, most of which were pretty useless, and I finally gave up on them, and I'm able to find my way around and get on planes and trains and walk in the city. I have to be very careful at intersections because I can't see whether the light is red, green, or yellow, so I wait till there are people beside me and only then step into the street. But I can't deal with text anymore. I have a lovely library upstairs, but all of those books I can't read anymore. My son is in psychoanalytic training, and so he has the benefit of the library now, which is gratifying to me. But I've had to adapt to the significant loss of my vision. I'm far from completely blind, but I am legally blind. But fortunately, this is the digital age, and with my iPhone, there's a magnifier, and I can blow things up, and I find all kinds of voice-to-text and other workarounds. And so this is me both mourning the loss of my vision, but at the same time my determined constructive, creative effort to rebuild the good object, to carry on with the goodness of life, to continue to be creative as much as I possibly can. This is an example of creative and constructive mourning activity. For Mrs. Klein, our first environment is our mother's body, and forever after, the earth, the environment, continues symbolically to represent the mother's body. We speak, for example, of Mother Nature. And today, of course, we are increasingly aware of how destructive we have been and continue to be towards Mother Nature. Klein feels that the child suffers from a kind of primordial guilt based on fantasies of attacking and devouring and emptying out and depleting the mother, depleting the sources of life, attacking the sources of life, greedily attacking the sources of life. Babies have to struggle with these feelings and fantasies and guilts, but imagine how much stirred up these fantasies are whenever we watch the news or have another report about melting ice caps and more species extinct, and then we read about the coming sixth extinction in the Anthropocene, climate destruction brought about by human activity. We are doing this to Mother Earth, and the destructive evidence, the evidence of our destructiveness is increasingly all around us. And what does this do to us psychologically? From a Kleinian point of view, it reinforces primordial fantasies of our destructiveness towards the mother, and leads to an increasing buildup of guilt and self-punishment, depression, despair, anxiety, and so on. So in this way, I think Kleinian theory has a relevance today, a peculiar relevance to our situation in the Anthropocene. What then is the creative or constructive response to our awareness of our destructiveness towards Mother Earth? It certainly would not be a matter of falling into despair and passivity. Well, failed mourning has to do with the object having been hated more than it's loved. And I think the truth is that human beings both love and hate life. We both love and hate the mother. We both love and hate the world. Freud talks about human malaise, the suffering that is involved in being a human being from day one, frustration, awareness of death, all of the many frustrations that human beings have to bear in order to get through the day. One writer referred to, he used the phrase, the ordeal of consciousness. To be a conscious human being is at times a great ordeal. So we don't just love life, we also hate it. We don't just love the earth, we also hate it. If our love predominates over our hate, we can mourn, and hopefully mourn creatively and reparatively. We can take action to stem climate disruption. In America, progressives in the Democratic Party are advocating a Green New Deal. But to the degree that we hate life more than love it, we may welcome its destruction, or be indifferent to the evidence of our destructiveness towards it. And so our future hangs in the balance. Are the lovers of life able to gain sufficient power politically and morally and culturally in time that steps may be taken to avert the impending catastrophe? Or are those who hate life or are indifferent towards it going to prevent the necessary reparative action? This remains to be seen, of course.